In early 2004, I was at the beginning stages of planning for my second CD, which was to have a gospel jazz theme. I had recently been performing as an extra vocalist with James Williams' intensive care unit band. James's music for this project was inspirational and gospel jazz themed. I was honored to be working with James because of his phenomenal musicianship and great music. Plus, I found him to be a wonderful person to know because he was always so caring and encouraging. So for all the above reasons, I asked James to play piano on my CD project, and he agreed to. Of course, before I could get it started, James passed. I went to his memorial service at St. Peter's Church in New York City. Mulgrew Miller was the final speaker. I had heard that James and Mulgrew were friends, and in his speech, Mulgrew made it clear that he considered James to be his mentor. I'm not usually impulsive, but at the end of the program, I went up to Mulgrew, and after brief preliminaries, I mentioned that James had agreed to play on my recording project and asked if he, Mulgrew, would consider doing the honors instead. But at the time, I hadn't realized how deeply these two were connected and that there was this larger brotherhood of musicians that were just as deeply connected. In the brief time that I knew him, James made quite an impression on me, and his music, especially the ICU music, really resonated with me and stayed with me over the years. So much so that I was inspired to want to get to know more about James, even to the point of going outside of my comfort zone and doing a project like this. In the process of interviewing these great musicians and long-term friends of James, I found the more I learned about James, the more fascinating to me it became just what kind of person James was. So this is a story of real friendship and love within a brotherhood of jazz musicians. But more specifically, it's a story of the man at the center of that brotherhood, James Williams. As Bill Easley says, James was the catalyst. So, how and when did you come to know James Williams?
Okay, that the main thing about that was, as I told you yesterday, I did a backward migration in 1971. I migrated to Memphis, Tennessee, whereas most cats from Memphis, Tennessee, the people that establish themselves, migrate north and they come to New York. I had already been to New York. I'd played with George Benson. I'd lived in Pittsburgh for a short spell, but I migrated to Memphis, Tennessee, because I knew at the time you have to, you go wherever you think that is going to work best for you.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
So I met James Williams within the first few days of after I got to Memphis, Tennessee. During those early days, I met James Williams, and he was a young, very ambitious, loving, curious musician, and he picked, since I was new in town, James went out of his way to pick my brain and find out what I knew. One thing I knew was standard, the songbook, and James Williams would show up at my doorstep unannounced from that point on to ask me about tunes and standards. And I have to admit, at the time, because I lived in a little shotgun rooming house and there was people, so I'd have to get up and go sit on the porch and talk to James Williams. It might be in the middle, it might be on a cold day, but it was, I didn't have space to, take somebody into the house, but James Williams would show up and knock on my door and we'd sit out on the porch and whatever. And he'd talk about this too, ask me about songs. And because he was just starting. So at that point on, James decided that he was going to make a conscious effort of learning a couple tunes a week. And he started that way back then. And eventually, boy, James started coming up with some tunes that I'd never heard of, you know.
Wow.
That's the way, James was always serious about what he was doing.
When and how did you first meet James?
I think I was he was about 3 years ahead of me in high school, but he went to Central, same high school that I did, Central High in Memphis. And I had a friend, Gary Topper, who played saxophone in the band with James. And he was I think Gary was a year older than me. So he knew James when he was at Central. And then he introduced me and James, I think, and they had jam sessions. Gary would have jam sessions in his parents' house, and then James also. So, and I was kind of the baby of the group. I was the youngest one of them.
Yeah.
But
Well, I started college in 1972. I guess at that time it was called Memphis State University, and now it's the University of Memphis. But started hearing about James right before I got there. And so I think the first few days I went around to the different practice rooms, and every time I heard somebody playing jazz piano, and I knocked on the door and peeped in and heard this guy playing piano. And I said, are you James Williams? And it turned out it was a saxophone player named Robert. Well, no, it was named Jerry Metcalf. And but he was a monster saxophonist, but he played really great piano. Then I heard someone else playing, knocked on the door, and there was another guy. I asked him, James Williams. He said, no, my name's Robert Garner. You probably know him as Bobby Lavelle.
Yeah, saxophone.
Yeah, man. But he played great piano, especially back then. And his father was one of the legendary organists around town. But anyway, finally, I stumbled up on James, and he took me under his wings and showed me the ropes. Because at that time, like I said, I knew basic harmony because I used to write for my high school band. But other than some 13 chords and the blues and F, I didn't know much of anything, and I didn't have any records. And so James, like I say, he would bring me to his house, turn me on the records, and take me around to the clubs to hear Phineas Newman, and when George Coleman, Harold Mabin would come to town and do concerts, he'd take me around with him. And yeah, just so I can say, anything to do with jazz, he was just really exposing me to it. And so that's how I got to know Phineas Newman fairly well, and Harold Mabin later, and George, and Frank Strozier.
I met James because I went to the matinee at the Jazz Workshop, whatever year that was, 76, 77. And I went down there, and it was Grover Washington. My friend Sid Simmons was playing piano with Grover. So I went down, and they used to have more or less a jam session. If the band leader was into having people sit in, he would let them. Some people wouldn't do that, but I even saw Mingus let people sit in. So I don't know if that was club policy and guys went for it or not. But I was down there, and Grover was there, right? So it was Sunday. And then my boy was playing piano, Sid. And all of a sudden I see this brother get up there, man, and start playing. I was like, whoa, that's different. Nobody in Boston played like that from the standpoint of the real history of music, or the history of jazz piano playing, and especially the history of Memphis jazz piano playing. So when you say that, you almost automatically either go back to some of the blues guys or Phineas Newborn. So man, James was playing, and at the end of his solo, he started doing that double-handed octave stuff, and tearing something up. And I had never heard anybody do that. At that time, I hadn't really paid any attention to guys who may have done it or or even heard guys like Phineas playing. At that time, I really hadn't experienced it. And when I heard that, I was like, whoa, like I've never met anybody. And that was even the older guys around Boston. I didn't hear that particular element, that technique. And that's a real Memphis thing, and it's a real Phineas Newborn thing. But played like intricate bebop lines and double hands. Never heard anybody. I was like, that's different, man. This guy's like, he's kind of unique, man, you know. And so he just introduced himself to me, or introduced myself to him. And from that moment on, we became fast friends. I mean, and basically he became my teacher. I was older than he was, but he was my informal teacher, or more accurate, my mentor, because he was, you know, he liked to tell people what to do in the best of ways, but certainly musically anyway. And he would, you know, say, you know, you got to work on this, you got to, you know, man. And, no, he would always do it like in the typical James. Well, I know you know this, and he would call a tune. Well, I know you know. Softly as on the morning sunrise, which I think I did know. I know you know how to. I know you have all those bebop tunes, all those Charlie Parker tunes memorized. I know you've been working on that. So that was his way of telling.
So that was his thing.
Yeah, that was his indirect way of telling him what you should do. He was saying, "Well, I know you already know how to do this." But James had no problem in kind of disguising his meddling in your in your musical development. But in that case, man, it was the best. You couldn't ask for a better person to sort of maybe hit you to what something you could work on, something that might be beneficial to you.
So he was mentoring you.
He was mentoring me. He was my mentor. It's not the other way
around. James came, said the springtime of 1991 to my school, Long Island University, to do a clinic hosted by Pete Yellen.
Oh, yeah.
The faculty advisor, you know, director of the jazz department.
I remember Pete, yeah.
Yeah, Pete.
I thought you guys, you didn't meet with the Harlem Boys Choir project?
No, or? He met Roger with the Harlem Boys Choir.
Oh, okay.
I left the Boys Choir in 1985.
Oh, all right.
Yeah. And Roger was still with them. And he did a program with them with, I think he did like a choral part with Self-Esteem, and Roger was playing piano.
Oh, I didn't know. Was that recorded at all?
Yeah, it was recorded.
Wow.
I saw it. I'm trying to remember. I saw it somewhere a couple of years ago. Yeah, it sounds great. You know what? I probably have a recording of it.
Cool. So he heard you sing at your school and
No, what he did was he was playing. I was checking out the clinic, and then he said, are there any singers in the house who would like to sing the blues? I just ran up on stage and started singing with him.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a fearless guy, so that's why he always said I was fearless, because that's how we met. Walked up there and we sang the blues. You know, we did 2 songs together, and that was great.
Wow, that's killing, yeah.
I first met James, as a matter of fact, speaking of Bill Easley, I recall both of them being on this particular gig. I was working with Kenny Burrell pretty regularly. Actually, one of the first people I started working with when I came to New York kind of regularly. And I mainly initially was hired to play with Kenny Quartet. That quartet had like Marcus McLaren and Jay Hogarth and Kenny. So, you know, we did tours, but I would often work with Kenny on offshoot projects, whether it be like a trio. And he had this one gig at the Blue Note, and he extended the group. So he had James and Bill. And that's the first time that I had heard of James. You know, I think I even seen James as a kid growing up in Chicago when he came to town with Blakey. Yeah. I know James was in that band. I mean, my mind was so much on Blakey, and actually Wynton was in the band, and they played at the Jazz Showcase. And I remember Lines Around the Corner. That's when it was the Blackstone Hotel. at the Blackstone, and everybody was there to see Winton, but it was Art's band, and James was in that band.
Yeah.
But again, I didn't get to know him. But the first time we actually played was had to be around 1989, 90,
Okay.
somewhere in there, and we did that gig together with Kenny.
Yeah, of course, I know you with playing with him with ICU, intensive
Right.
care unit. But what other bands? You must have played with him with probably a lot of other bands.
Yeah, we did. So funny story. So we had played that gig with Kenny, and we got to know each other. I'm sure you remember. You remember the Tower Records on Broadway.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that place at times would be like a hang,
Yeah.
where you would see all the cats would come
Yeah.
in. And
Iconic place.
around
Yeah.
1990, I ran into James there,
Okay.
and James was like, "Man, I've been trying to get in touch with you. I'm putting together this band, and I want you to be in this band." And he was talking about intensive care unit. So it was a few years before that actually came to fruition. But he was, and he kind of told me who he had in mind. At the time, I think he had mentioned Kenny Davis on bass. He had some specific people in mind, and he already had the vision of what he was trying to do. With crossing over different influences and the gospel undercurrent. So he had some very specific people in mind to do it. And that was kind of the birth of ICU.
There's a tenor player in Memphis named Herman Green.
Yeah. Okay.
Him. He was he had played with Lionel Hampton, and he came back, and his mother was sick or something, so he came back to live there again. So he had a band called the Green Machine. We play, and so James was enlisted by Herman to do that, and then James got me into that band with his other friends, Sylvester Sample, who was a bass player, and James Baker, a drummer that was in my high school, and he had a gig at a Holiday Inn that was like 6 nights a week at that time. We got a lot of experience just playing, with Herman. We play a set of jazz with Herman, and then it was a set like cabaret, dancing girls and stuff.
Oh,
had a show.
It was like a floor show.
His little church in Memphis. He had the Hallelujah horns in there. Man, he put his band. He had it was a little black Baptist church in Memphis. He had Bill Mobley and probably Sticks Beck. He had all these white kids in there playing in the band.
Hallelujah horns.
Hallelujah horns. That was James. I think that was one of the James creations. You have to ask Bill Mobley.
That's interesting. Because I called Bill Mobley up after he gave me his number and just spoke to him briefly about this. And I mentioned, he called me back. I was at my church and the choir was singing. I said, yeah, I'm at my church. And then he asked me about my church. And I said, yeah, I have a horn section that I bring into the church. And he seemed interested in that. He's like,
he wanted a gig.
And he had some church gigs, and he called them the Hallelujah Horns. The horn section together.
Hallelujah Horns. All right.
He called them Hallelujah Horns. And his church, Eastern Star Baptist Church, was right there in Midtown, Memphis. So. He was heavily, involved with that. I think he was 3 or 4 nights a week. He was over there,
really
playing. Choir. He was the pianist or an organist or whatever. I think he pulled Mulgrew into that too later. Like they were both on keyboard.
What was the music at the church? Was it like contemporary gospel that they were doing?
Yeah, just standard gospel. I mean, hymns and stuff.
Hymns, okay.
Called Calvary and
the spirituals.
Spirituals, yeah.
Another pianist named Charles Thomas, and he Harold Mabin always credited him as being the one who turned him on to the jazz, and Harold was a monster. Charles was a monster player, and he was telling him, man, you really dig what I'm doing. You got to check out Phineas Newman.
Phineas or Charles, any of those guys ever teach? Did any of you guys study with them?
No, like I said, I was able to sit down at the piano a few times with Phineas and with Charles, but it wasn't lessons per se. I would think James would have had the opportunity more with him being 3 years older. But James would take when Mobley came to Memphis State a year after me, and so James used to take us down here. Charles Thomas.
He seemed to pull a lot of people together.
Absolutely. James had a circle of friends. James was warm and kind to everybody. If he met a young student or somebody who was James would give him his all, man. And I think of not only James, I saw some development. James was a young person, but let's just say Donald Brown, Mulgrew Miller, George Caldwell. In other words, James James encouraged and pointed those guys in the right direction. You understand?
So George Caldwell was down there at the same time with them?
Yeah. Well, again, sometimes they for what? See, George sometimes is not included in it. People talk about James, Mulgrew, and Donald.
Yeah.
Don't necessarily include George in that circle, but George was there. He knew James before I did, but George at that was a classical piano player. George, when George came back to Memphis, George had just come from Oberlin, graduated from Oberlin, and he was really sort of just getting into jazz.
Yeah. Did you know George Caldwell?
Oh yeah, I knew George very well. Matter of fact, we still tight to this day. I just forwarded him something a few days ago. He was at Memphis State before I got there. George, I think, maybe 3 or 4 years older than me.
Oh, okay.
And when I first met him, he was mainly into classical music, and then he was slowly getting turned on to jazz, and I kind of watched him evolve into this great jazz pianist that he is.
Yeah.
And I gave George his first gig in Memphis. I gave Mulgrew his first gig, I
always tell people probably my really first major jazz gig in Memphis was playing with Bill Easley. And so that's, he was, after James, he was the next mentor for me that, just being on the bandstand with him, you're going to learn something.
There were jam sessions, a lot of jam sessions in Memphis, especially at James's house with everybody would be standing around, like Donald would be there sometimes, all kind of people. And his parents.
Wow.
I can still visualize that house, that room he had. I mean, he had just albums everywhere, LPs, his piano.
What was he like, in those jam sessions at his house? Was he kind of organizing things?
Yeah, he was very industrious. He seemed to always have stuff for us to play. Like he had worked it out. He transcribed, Wayne Shorter pieces or Miles or, he had charts on all this stuff. I wouldn't know. At that point, I wouldn't know how to do what he was doing. He really had a lot together. He was harmonically and everything. He was way advanced in what I was doing. Everyone wanted to play with him.
Really?
I was lucky, I guess, to get exposed like that. I mean, we didn't have, back then, we didn't have all the internet resources. You can just go get anything now. I mean, back then, if you wanted to learn a tune like that, so if you want to learn to Speak No Evil or something like that, you'd have to go get the record, LP, find it somewhere in a which
Yeah.
they didn't know have it. We're sharing each other's LPs, you know, so he'd take a big marker and put your initials on that, because he'd keep it for like a month.
Really?
I eventually get it back, and he, you know, I had a bunch of his with his initials on it.
Wow.
And but he had his own little group of people. Most of them were in Memphis. But for a time there, before Donald taught at Berkeley, Donald Brown was in Boston, and Mobley Miller. I think they were all living together. And then later on, there was a guy named Stix Baker, who was a drummer. Stix Baker, of course. Yeah. And then Bill Mobley. So they came up later. And so sometimes guys would just come up and stay for a while in Boston, check out the scene, play a little bit, and go back to Memphis, because most of them hadn't left Memphis then. But it was he had this flow of people going back and forth. And then even a guy named Mike Hyman, who was a drummer, who was like a kid. He was like 17 years old, I think, when he came to Boston. He must have been right out of high school, but he was a pretty rough drummer. He was a star. I won't say star, but he was a really great drummer, and he was pretty well known from the Jamie Ablesall camps, which James had been doing before I even knew they existed. And so he basically imported a band. So a lot of guys, when they came out, after I graduated from Berkeley, guys came in, and then so there was somebody who could play, who was of a like-minded kind of musical spirit. We played with. But then when James came, it had been a lull, and James cranked it back up, and he cranked it back up in a big way, because James was one of those guys whose philosophy, he didn't articulate it this way, but if there wasn't anything going on, well, let's make something go on. Or if there wasn't any gigs, let's go find a gig, or let's go make a gig. James opened up. I mean, I think the Willow Jazz was sort of a collaboration between James and this other piano player, Brian Walkley. But James was kind of like the resident guy, and Brian was a piano player. And basically, it was his thing, man. It was like a little gangster joint, and but we ended up playing there.
When I came up here, well, he had, when I was living in Boston, he had bands that he put together to play at a club. It's called the Willow Jazz Club in Boston. He had Alan Dawson on drums usually, and John Lockwood on the bass. And then he'd have different guest artists he would bring in. So I was involved with stuff like Frank Strozier. He'd bring him in, and which, I mean, he was really good at getting people to come play at this little club. And it was always packed, so he did well doing these guest artist things. That would be like a side man on some of those gigs.
James Williams was one of the greatest friends that I ever had, man. I mean, in terms of when I use the word friend, I don't use that word loosely, because associates, we have people that we know, we have family, we have friend. I take the word friend very seriously. And James Williams, with unequivocally, was one of the greatest friends that I ever had. As time goes on, I look back of friends that I had back. Most of my friends were older cats, you know, my close friends, the cats that I talk to regularly, or guys that I used to talk to almost every day. All of those people are not on the planet anymore. So, but James was one of those people that I consider to be one of the greatest friends that I ever had.
When I first met you, we were in the saxophone section of the After Midnight band doing that show. And I knew that you had worked with James, and I brought James up, and you had a lot to say. And I could feel the love. I could feel that it was, you guys had a special friendship, you know.
Oh yeah. because that's the kind of person James was, the type of person, man. And it's a spiritual thing, man. James was a very kind, giving person. There's three types of people: givers, takers, and users. And James Williams was a bona fide giver, man. You know, he was very good to his friends. Not only, you know, things developed later on with recordings and him moving to Boston and moving to New York and things. So things progressed from those early days in Memphis, you know, but that was the foundation of what became what I call a great friendship. And I don't know, I know that you're going to be talking to other people, and I'm almost willing to bet that all of those people would go so far as to say that James Williams was one of the greatest friends.
He felt friendship. He felt kind of a love for most people and brotherhood, you know, and it wasn't kind of wear on your sleeve like, yeah, I love everybody kind of stuff. But if you were his friend, you were his friend. You know?
So it's like I tell people, you know, I wouldn't be where I'm at today if it wasn't for James. Because I felt like a lot of times he put me before himself.
Like, he always considered me his son, so he was my father. You know, my dad loved him. My parents loved him. You know, and my parents came out to the gig that we double billed with Bags at the Blue Note, and my dad said, it was funny. I laughed. My dad said, I just want to make sure you're gonna let Miles be Miles Griffith. I want to see Miles Griffith. My dad knows how I am. He would hear me practice. So he's like, I want to hear all that crazy stuff.
That's great.
Yeah. So he's like, oh, he said, definitely. I'm going to let him, I'm going to let him go. Let him do the thing. So that was the thing that I really loved about James. You know, he let you be yourself. Easley was up here 2 weeks ago, and he was going to be playing after the band I was singing with at Swing 46. He was talking about James, talking about how James would have all his people get along with one another. Everybody gets along with one another.
That's beautiful.
You know? Yeah.
So it was a friendship, man.
Yeah.
They're just unbelievably, you know, a story of just people who really care a lot about each other. Fast forward, man, we're living in a time now to where people are so unengaged, man. I mean, not, you know, the pandemic hurt, but even the whole political scene, the whole environment today, man, it's sad.
I see all the projects between you and James and Donald Brown and Mulgrew and Bill Mobley and Bill Pierce. You guys did so much together. I could see the camaraderie.
Like James was a catalyst, man. James Williams was a catalyst.
Wow.
James, I always, when there's a post on Facebook or something about his birthday or something, I sum up James, I say, James Williams loved all of his friends, and he insisted that they love each other.